Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive all about denial of service attacks. We've got some really interesting source material on this, and by the end, I think you'll really have a good grasp on these attacks, how they work, why they matter, and most importantly, what you can actually do about them.
Yeah, definitely a topic worth exploring for sure.
So to kind of set the stage,
Mm-hmm.
imagine a popular store, right?
Right.
Suddenly it's just packed with people, but none of them are actually dying anything. They're just there to cause chaos, blocking the real customers from even getting in the door.
Yeah.
That's essentially what a denial of service attack or a DOS attack does to websites and online services.
That's a really good analogy, actually. The goal of a DOS attack is to just overwhelm the target system with so much traffic that it just becomes unusable for legitimate users. And it's important to note that this isn't just websites that are vulnerable. We're talking about any system or network connected to the internet.
So it really could be anything.
Pretty much.
I've heard the term DDoS attack thrown around a lot.
Uh-huh.
What's the difference between a DOS and a DDoS attack?
The key difference is in the source of the attack. A DOS attack originates from a single source, while a DDoS attack, which stands for Distributed Denial of Service Attack, involves multiple sources flooding the target simultaneously.
Okay, so multiple sources.
Exactly.
So like instead of just one person trying to crowd the entrance to the store,
Right.
it's like a whole flash mob all coordinating to block the door.
Exactly. It's like having a single fire hose pointed at a building versus having 100 fire hoses all pointed at the same building at once.
So DDoS is like DOS, but on steroids.
Pretty much. And what makes DDoS attacks so effective and so difficult to defend against is the use of botnets. These are networks of computers that have been infected with malware that allows the attacker to control them remotely. And they can use them to flood the target with traffic.
So if I'm understanding this right, building a botnet essentially allows an attacker to multiply their firepower. They're turning a bunch of ordinary computers into a weaponized army of traffic generators.
Exactly. And that's why botnets are such a significant threat in the world of cybersecurity.
Okay, so let's say you're a business owner or really anyone who relies on online services. How can you tell if you're under a DOS attack? What are some of the warning signs?
Well, one of the most obvious signs is a sudden and significant slowdown in website performance. If your website is suddenly taking forever to load, or if users are experiencing lag and delays, that could be a sign of a DOS attack in progress.
So slow performance is one thing to look out for. What else?
Another common symptom is frequent and unexplained crashes. If your website or your online service is crashing repeatedly and there's no obvious technical explanation, a DOS attack could very well be the culprit. The system is simply being bombarded with more requests than it can handle.
It's like trying to stuff 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag. Eventually something's got to give.
Exactly.
So slow performance crashes, okay.
Yeah, right.
Hmm.
And then there's the traffic itself. You want to keep a close eye on your traffic patterns. A sudden surge in traffic, especially from suspicious locations, could be a sign that something's not right. For example, if you see a massive spike in visitors from a country you don't normally do business with, that's a red flag.
Okay, so slow performance, crashes, unusual traffic spikes. Those are all starting to sound like a pattern. Is there anything else?
Absolutely. Pay attention to your users. They're often the first line of defense. If you're getting reports from customers about difficulties accessing your website, logging in, or completing transactions, that's a strong indication that something's amiss. It's always wise to take user reports seriously, as they could be the first clue that a DOS attack is underway.
Right, so it's like if you're that store owner and all of a sudden all your customers are complaining that they can't get through the door.
Exactly. You'd want to investigate what's going on.
Yeah. Right, okay, so we've got a pretty good idea of what a DOS attack is and how to recognize one. Now, I'm curious about the people behind these attacks. Who are they and what motivates them to launch these attacks in the first place?
Well, the motivations behind DOS attacks can be quite diverse, actually. In some cases, it's all about the money. Hackers might launch a DOS attack and then demand a ransom to stop it. It's essentially holding your website or your online service hostage until you pay up.
So it's extortion.
Exactly, a form of digital extortion.
So disrupt your business and then offer to fix the problem for a fee.
Right.
Pretty cynical. But I imagine money isn't the only motivator here.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's more personal. Revenge is another common driver. A disgruntled employee, a former business partner, or even just someone with a grudge could launch a DOS attack to cause damage and disruption. They're not necessarily looking for financial gain. They simply want to inflict harm or get back at someone they perceive as having wronged them.
So it's like a digital vendetta.
Yeah, you could say it.
And I'm guessing these attacks can have some pretty serious consequences for the victims.
Oh, they absolutely can. We'll definitely delve into the potential fallout of DOS attacks in more detail a bit later, but it's safe to say that the consequences can be pretty severe both in the short and long term.
Okay, so before we get to those consequences, I'm curious about another motivation I've heard about, hacktivism. Can you explain what that is and how it relates to DOS attacks?
Sure, hacktivism is essentially the use of hacking techniques to promote a political or social cause. Hacktivist groups might target websites or networks of organizations they disagree with, using DOS attacks to disrupt their operations, deface their websites, or simply draw attention to their cause.
So it's like a form of digital protest. Instead of marching in the streets, they're flooding servers with traffic.
Precisely. And while the goals of hacktivists may sometimes seem noble, their methods can be quite disruptive and controversial, raising a lot of ethical questions about the acceptable limits of online protest.
Right, because it's one thing to hold up a sign or give a speech, but it's another thing entirely to shut down someone's website or prevent people from accessing essential online services.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Well, we'll definitely have to unpack those ethical questions a bit later on. But for now, let's stick with the practical side of things. Assuming someone is motivated to launch a DOS attack, how do they actually go about doing it? What are the technical steps involved?
Well, there are various methods attackers can use, and they often involve exploiting vulnerabilities in the target system's software or network configuration. One common approach is to just flood the target with a massive volume of requests, overwhelming its capacity to process them all.
So I'm picturing a server working hard to process all the incoming requests, like a chef trying to keep up with the never-ending stream of orders during a dinner rush. But at some point, the server just gets overloaded and crashes, right?
Exactly. And the attacker's goal is to trigger that crash to make the system unavailable to legitimate users.
So the goal is to basically break the system.
Right, to make it unusable.
Now, we talked earlier about botnets and how they can amplify the power of a DOS attack. How are these botnets created in the first place? I mean, how does an attacker gain control of so many computers?
Well, it often starts with malware. Hackers spread malicious software through various means, such as phishing emails, infected websites, or software vulnerabilities. Once that malware is installed on a computer, it can give the attacker remote control, turning that computer into a bot or a zombie under their command.
So it's like a stealthy invasion.
Yeah.
Infecting computers and then turning them against their owners.
Right, and once they have enough infected computers, they can launch a coordinated attack, flooding a target with traffic from all directions.
So it's a numbers game in a way.
Yeah.
The bigger the botnet, the harder it is to defend against.
Exactly, which is why preventing the creation of botnets is such a crucial aspect of cybersecurity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground so far. We've talked about what DOS attacks are, how to recognize them, the motivations behind them, and even how attackers create those botnets to amplify their attacks. But let's shift gears now and talk about the consequences of these attacks. You mentioned earlier that they can be pretty severe.
Oh, they can be devastating both for individuals and for businesses. Let's start with the financial impact. If your website is down even for a short period of time, you're losing money. Every minute your site is inaccessible means lost sales, lost productivity, and potentially lost customers.
So it's like your digital storefront suddenly shutting its doors, customers can't get in, they can't buy anything, and you're just losing revenue.
Precisely, and those losses can add up quickly, especially for businesses that rely heavily on online sales or services.
Right. And I imagine it's not just about the immediate financial hit either. There's got to be a long-term impact as well.
Oh, absolutely. A DOS attack can also severely damage your reputation. If customers consistently experience problems accessing your website or your online services, they're going to start losing trust in your brand. And once you lose that trust, it can be incredibly difficult to win it back.
So it's not just about the money you lose during the attack. It's about the potential loss of customer loyalty and the long-term damage to your brand.
Exactly.
It's like getting a bad review online that just stays there forever.
Right, it can really hurt your business in the long run. And then there's the operational disruption. If your internal systems are affected by a DOS attack, your employees may be unable to work, further impacting your productivity and your bottom line.
So it's like a ripple effect. The attack disrupts your online services, which impacts your customers, which then affects your employees and your overall operations.
Exactly. It's a chain reaction of negative consequences. And then if sensitive data is compromised during the attack, you could be facing legal ramifications as well. Companies can be held liable for failing to protect customer data, leading to lawsuits, regulatory fines, and further damage to their reputation.
Wow. So the costs extend far beyond just the immediate financial losses. We're talking about potential long-term damage to your reputation, operational disruptions, and even legal consequences. That's a pretty sobering picture.
It is, which is why it's so important to understand the threat of DOS attacks and take steps to protect yourself.
Well, that brings us to the next logical question. What can we do to prevent these attacks from happening in the first place?
There are actually a number of strategies you can implement to bolster your defenses. One of the most effective is using a content delivery network, or a CDN.
Okay, CDN. Break that down for us. What is it and how does it help prevent DOS attacks?
Sure. A CDN is essentially a network of servers that are distributed across various geographical locations. It caches your website's content on these servers, so when a user tries to access your site, the content is delivered from the server that's closest to them.
So it's like having multiple copies of your website spread out around the world, each ready to serve up content to users in its region.
Exactly. And this helps distribute traffic and absorb any sudden surges, making it much harder for an attacker to overwhelm your main server.
So using a CDN is like having a buffer, a shock absorber, to protect your main website from being overwhelmed by that sudden flood of traffic.
That's a good way to think about it. But CDNs aren't the only line of defense. Firewalls and intrusion detection systems are also crucial components of a robust cybersecurity strategy.
Okay, I've heard of firewalls, but intrusion detection systems are a bit new to me. Can you explain how those work?
Sure. Firewalls are essentially barriers between your network and the outside world. They filter incoming and outgoing traffic based on predefined rules, blocking any suspicious or malicious traffic from reaching your servers.
So they're like the digital bouncers guarding the entrance to your network, checking IDs and turning away anyone who doesn't belong.
Exactly. Intrusion detection systems, or IDSs, take a more proactive approach. They monitor network traffic for any signs of suspicious activity, such as attempts to exploit vulnerabilities or to access sensitive data. If an IDS detects a potential threat, it can alert administrators and even take automated actions to block or mitigate the attack.
So while firewalls are like the bouncers at the door, intrusion detection systems are more like the security cameras and motion sensors constantly scanning for any signs of trouble.
That's a good analogy. And by combining these different security measures, you can create a layered defense that makes it much harder for attackers to penetrate your systems.
Okay, that's a good start. But I'm guessing there's more we can do to prevent DOS attacks, right?
Absolutely. Regular monitoring of your traffic patterns is crucial. By analyzing your normal traffic flow, you can more easily identify any unusual spikes or suspicious activity that could indicate a DOS attack in progress. It's like keeping an eye on your bank account. If you see a sudden and unexpected withdrawal, you're going to investigate.
Makes sense. It's all about spotting those red flags early on.
Right. And another important technique is rate limiting.
Rate limiting. What's that?
It's a way to control the rate at which a user can make requests to your server. By limiting the number of requests allowed from a single source within a specific time frame, you can make it more difficult for attackers to flood your system with traffic.
So it's like putting a speed limit on incoming traffic to prevent a jam.
Exactly. And if you're dealing with a particularly persistent attacker, you might consider using a technique called black holing.
Black holing. That sounds intense. What does that involve?
It's a more aggressive approach where you essentially redirect all traffic from a specific IP address or range of IP addresses to a non-existent server, effectively dropping the traffic into a black hole. It's a way to completely shut down communication with a known attacker, preventing them from flooding your server.
So it's like cutting off all contact with a nuisance caller. You just block their number and they can't reach you anymore.
Exactly. But black holing should be used with caution because it can have unintended consequences if it's implemented incorrectly. For example, if you accidentally black hole a legitimate IP address, you could end up blocking legitimate users from accessing your services.
Right. So it's a powerful tool, but it's important to use it wisely and make sure you're not blocking the good guys along with the bad guys.
Precisely. And for organizations that require even more robust protection, there are specialized DDoS protection services available.
Okay, so these are the big leagues now.
Right. Companies like Cloudflare and Akamai offer services that are specifically designed to mitigate large-scale DDoS attacks. They have massive networks and sophisticated technologies that can filter out malicious traffic and keep your services online even under a very heavy attack.
So they're like the cybersecurity equivalent of SWAT teams, ready to deploy when the situation gets really serious.
That's one way to put it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on prevention. But what if, despite our best efforts, an attack is already happening? What do we do then? What's the action plan?
That's a great question. And we'll dive into the specifics of responding to a DOS attack in the next segment. Okay, so picking up right where we left off, let's say you've noticed those warning signs we talked about, and you suspect a DOS attack might be happening right now. What should you do?
Well, I imagine the first step is don't panic.
That's always good advice in any crisis situation.
Huh.
Once you've taken a breath, the most important thing is to act quickly. The sooner you respond, the better your chances of minimizing the damage and getting your services back online.
Okay, so speed is key. But where do we even start? Who do we call? Ghostbusters.
Not quite. Your first call should be to your hosting provider or your IT team. They have the expertise and the resources to help you analyze the situation, identify the source of the attack, and implement the appropriate countermeasures.
Okay, so call in the experts. What? Assuming I'm not so what can I do to try and fight back against this?
Well, if you have the capability, you can use your security tools to block or filter traffic coming from suspicious IP addresses or sources. Many firewalls and intrusion detection systems allow you to create rules that block traffic from specific locations or that match certain patterns.
So it's like putting up a digital barricade, selectively blocking traffic from the sources that are most likely to be part of the attack.
That's a good analogy. Another tactic you might consider is increasing your server capacity. If you have the option to quickly scale up your resources, you can temporarily increase your bandwidth or add more servers to handle the increased traffic load.
So it's like calling in reinforcements, bolstering your defenses to withstand the onslaught. But what if those measures aren't enough? What if the attack is just too overwhelming?
Well, in some cases, the best course of action might be to temporarily take your site offline. I know it sounds drastic, but sometimes it's the most effective way to stop the bleeding, to minimize damage and regain control of the situation.
So it's like a tactical retreat, giving yourself time to regroup and assess the situation before launching a counteroffensive.
Exactly. And while your site is offline, you can work with your hosting provider or your IT team to identify and fix the vulnerabilities that allowed the attack to occur in the first place.
So it's not just about stopping the current attack, it's about preventing future attacks by addressing those underlying weaknesses in your systems.
Right. It's like patching up a leaky roof. You can keep bailing out the water, but the best solution is to fix the roof itself and prevent the leaks from happening in the first place.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those cases where the attacker's motives go beyond just disruption? What if it's a ransomware attack where they're demanding money to stop the attack?
Yeah, that's a tricky situation. The FBI generally advises against paying ransom, as it encourages further criminal activity and doesn't guarantee that the attacker will actually stop the attack.
So it's a gamble, and the odds aren't necessarily in your favor, but I imagine there are situations where paying the ransom might be the least bad option, especially if the alternative is losing critical data or suffering irreparable damage to your business.
It's a difficult decision, and there's no easy answer. Each case needs to be evaluated on its own merits, weighing the risks and benefits of paying versus not paying.
Hopefully we can avoid getting into that situation in the first place by taking the necessary precautions to prevent these attacks from happening.
Exactly. Prevention is always the best medicine. But let's say, despite your best efforts, you've been hit with a DOS attack, and you've managed to mitigate the immediate damage. What's the next step?
Well, I imagine it's important to document everything that happened. You want to have a record of the attack for legal purposes, right?
Absolutely. Detailed documentation is crucial. You want to keep a log of everything. The time the attack started, the symptoms you observed, the steps you took to respond, and any communication you had with your hosting provider, your IT team, or law enforcement.
So it's like building a case file, gathering all the evidence you might need if you decide to pursue legal action or file an insurance claim.
That's a good way to think about it. And the information you gather during the attack can also be valuable for improving your security posture in the future. By analyzing the attack, you can identify vulnerabilities that need to be addressed and develop strategies to prevent similar attacks from happening again.
So it's not just about reacting to the current attack. It's about learning from it and becoming more resilient in the future.
Exactly. Every attack is an opportunity to learn and improve. And speaking of learning, I think it's time to shift gears a bit and delve into some of the broader implications of DOS attacks.
Okay, what do you have in mind?
Well, we've talked about the technical aspects, the motivations, the consequences, and the preventative measures, but I think it's important to also consider the ethical dimensions of these attacks, especially when they're motivated by hacktivism.
Right. We touched on that earlier, but I think it's worth exploring in more detail. After all, hacktivism is a complex issue with no easy answers.
Exactly. On the surface, hacktivism might seem like a justified form of protest, a way to fight for a cause to challenge those in power. But it's not always that simple, is it?
Not at all. The problem with DOS attacks, even when they're motivated by seemingly noble intentions, is that they often inflict collateral damage. Disrupting a website or a network can have far-reaching consequences impacting innocent individuals who rely on those services.
That's an important point. Think about a hacktivist group targeting a government website to protest a particular policy. On the surface, it might seem like a targeted action against a specific entity. But what if that website also provides essential services to citizens, like access to healthcare information or social welfare programs?
Right. The unintended consequences can be significant. And even if the target is a corporation or a large organization, a DOS attack can still disrupt the lives of ordinary people who rely on those services. Think about a DOS attack against a bank or a financial institution. It's not just the company that suffers, it's the customers who can't access their accounts or make transactions.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of censorship. Even if we disagree with the views or actions of a particular organization, using a DOS attack to silence them raises concerns about freedom of speech and the right to dissent.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Because who gets to decide what speech is acceptable and what deserves to be shut down? Today, it's a website you disagree with, but tomorrow it could be a news organization, a political party, or even just an individual expressing an unpopular opinion.
Exactly. And while it's important to acknowledge the potential for positive change that can stem from activism, it's equally important to consider the methods used and the potential for harm.
Right. The ends don't justify the means, especially when those means involve disrupting essential services or silencing dissenting voices.
Exactly. There are other ways to advocate for change, to raise awareness, to challenge injustice, without resorting to tactics that can cause widespread disruption and harm.
So as we conclude this deep dive into denial of service attacks, I think the key takeaway here is that the internet, for all its wonders and possibilities, is also a double-edged sword.
It is.
It can be a powerful tool for communication, collaboration, and progress,
Yeah.
but it can also be weaponized, used to disrupt, to damage, and to silence.
It's up to all of us to understand these threats, to take steps to protect ourselves, and to engage in thoughtful discussions about the responsible and ethical use of technology.
And I think this deep dive has given us a lot to think about. We've explored the technical aspects of DOS attacks, the motivations behind them, the potential consequences, and the steps we can take to prevent and mitigate them. But we've also delved into the ethical considerations, particularly the use of DOS attacks for hacktivism, which raises important questions about freedom of speech, censorship, and the responsible use of technology.
It has.
But before we wrap up completely, there's one final thought I'd like to leave you with. We've focused on the negative aspects of DOS attacks, but there's another side to this coin. The techniques used in DOS attacks can also be used for good.
Oh, that's an interesting point. Tell me more about that.
For example, researchers and security professionals sometimes use controlled DOS simulations to test the resilience of networks and systems, to identify vulnerabilities and strengthen defenses.
Right. So it's like a controlled experiment to make sure those systems can withstand a real attack.
Exactly. And in some cases, DOS techniques have even been used to disrupt malicious activities, like taking down botnets or interfering with spam campaigns.
So it's a bit like fighting fire with fire, using the same techniques, but for a different purpose, to protect rather than to harm.
Exactly. It's a reminder that technology itself is neutral. It's how we choose to use it that determines its impact, whether for good or for ill.
That's a profound thought. It all comes down to intent and a responsibility.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into denial of service attacks.
We have.
I hope you found this exploration informative and engaging.
I hope so too.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about cybersecurity threats, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and to navigate the digital world safely and responsibly.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe online.
Until next time.
So we're wrapping up our deep dive on denial of service attacks. We've really gone deep, haven't we?
We have, from the nuts and bolts of how these attacks work all the way to the ethics of using them.
And I think anyone listening has a much better idea now of how to protect themselves.
Definitely. Understanding the threat is the first step to defending against it.
One big takeaway for me is that Security is all about layers.
Couldn't agree more. You can't just rely on one thing, right? It's like locking your front door but leaving all the windows wide open.
Right. You got to combine those different strategies. Firewalls, intrusion detection systems, CDNs, rate limiting, all of it working together to make your systems tougher to crack.
And don't forget the human element, too. Even with all the tech in the world, security awareness is crucial.
Absolutely, because a phishing email can sneak past any firewall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So educating yourself and your team about the latest threats, that's vital. Knowing how to spot phishing attempts, creating strong passwords, avoiding dodgy websites.
It's like building a security mindset. Everyone's got to be on board, right?
Right.
Protecting themselves, protecting the whole organization.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that's a message worth repeating to everyone listening. Cybersecurity is not just for the IT folks, it's a shared responsibility.
Well said. So, to everyone out there, we hope this deep dive into denial of service attacks was insightful and that you feel more prepared now.
Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay proactive when it comes to your online security.
And remember, the internet's always changing. New threats pop up all the time.
That's right. Don't get complacent. Stay up to date on those threats and vulnerabilities and take those steps to protect yourself and your organization.
And if you ever run into a cybersecurity issue, don't be afraid to ask for help. There's lots of support out there. Security professionals, government agencies, even online communities can give you guidance.
You're never alone in this. We're all in this together.
That's a good point. Well, I think that brings our deep dive to a close.
It does.